and here tonight really excited to launch this Good Web Network. What we really want to be doing with this is building a community with you all and with kind of wider stakeholders around how do we really deliver on the good web. And the concept of the good web is something at Demos we've been working on over the last few years, in very large part driven by one of our esteemed panelists tonight. And so what we really want to be thinking about is if we've got a principled vision of what...
moment, we had courses from the Good Web project being set up at universities in the States. It was also very, very exciting, and it kind of made me think if we were going to talk about it today, perhaps I could talk to you guys a little bit about kind of where the whole thing started. And really this is a story not so much about technology so much as it is about language and vocabulary, and that's kind of what the origin story of the Good Web project was. In what feels like many years ago, I remember on a sort of, I think, a rainy Wednesday morning, sat in somewhere on Whitehall listening to Sajid Javid, who I think at the time was Home Secretary, and Jeremy Wright, who I think at the time was the Minister of DCMS, and they sort of did this kind of good cop, bad cop, or kind of bad cop, worst cop impression, explaining, telling us about why we needed to regulate the internet back in 2015 and why they were going to have something called the Online Safety Bill. And they would sort of explain to me, or to explain to the audience really what the internet was. And the internet was radicalization, and it was hate speech, and it was terrorist recruitment and grooming, and it was having a terrible mental health effects on everybody, and blah, blah, blah. We sort of, and this was great, very, very exciting, because this was precisely what Demos, I realized, had been saying for the past 4 years, because at the time Chasm had been a research hub that had been looking at all these kinds of terrible things that were happening on the internet. And it struck me that we were very good at talking about what bad looks like, but we were very bad at talking about what good looks like. What did we want to replace it with? And that struck me as problematic, because I never heard Mark Zuckerberg talking about what bad looks like. I never heard Xi Jinping talking about what a bad Chinese internet looked like. I never heard about the crypto bros living in their basements talking about what bad looks like. They would talk about what good looks like. In fact, it was only really liberal democracies that struggled to conceptualize what a good internet would look like. We were very good at talking about what bad looks like. I think there's loads of reasons for that. Some of it, I think, is hubris. I think there was a real from the days of seeing smartphones in Tahrir Square and thinking that perhaps Facebook might be the vanguard for democracy as it swept through the world. Some of it, I think, is just a language gap. I think we struggle with finding words for what for describing things on the internet. If you think about the stuff that we talk about reach, and we talk about community, and we talk about safety online. None of these words really mean anything without that. They are very often borrowed from spaces. The public square is another good example. Borrowed from concepts that have been kicking around for years, but that don't really apply very well online. And some of it, I think, is just disagreement. If you think about the UK versus India versus Germany versus the US, I think you find democracies that are coming to the fore. Older democracies, perhaps, that are finding that they aren't built on as solid foundations as they perhaps thought they were, and they all demand something different from online spaces. And so the question basically came to what would a good internet look like? What does an internet that is working towards and supportive of democracy look like? Now, I bought a high definition webcam and spent the entire pandemic just shouting that question again and again at anybody who would listen. And that works really well as a kind of conversation starter for about 18 months. And then after 18 months, the first person turns around and they say, okay, so what does a good internet look like? And you look real stupid if you don't have an answer. So then we had a difficult 6 months where we had to try to come up with an answer. And the answer that I will give you is one that is not necessarily a solutions-based one, but it's one in language. And that is just a piece of vocabulary, which is infrastructure. And that was the model that we ended up with. And this is the pitch. Democracies need things. Societies need stuff. You ask some people, they'll tell you that democracies need green space. They need access. You need access to the market. Perhaps you need education. Perhaps you need free access to information. Democracies need things. We kind of have a European tradition here of provisioning some of that stuff, like infrastructure. roads would be another useful one. Sewage systems might be another useful metaphor. And we have had a 20-year experiment of what happens when you provision nothing as infrastructure. Everything is provisioned by market forces, and primarily by Californian advertising companies. And I think that experiment has failed. And I think the remedy to that experiment is to start conceiving of things online as being, they ought to be provisioned infrastructurally. And so the answer that we came to was that the Good Web project is a public infrastructure project. And I can talk perhaps later about where I think that infrastructure is being built, because I think it is, and I think that's really where the future lies, and where we need to start thinking not only about the transition of power from major market players at the moment, but also supporting, encouraging, influencing, talking to the people who are building the infrastructural layer that comes next.
Thank you so much. So I want to turn to Colin now to answer one of the questions that Alex has raised around, we've got all these concepts and all of these things we want to achieve, and Colin at Ofcom is at the very forefront of having to do this actually in practice. Likely when the online safety bill comes in, that you're going to have to deal with a lot of how do we make this into reality? So we'd love to hand over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So I think one of the things to say to begin with is that there are a lot of elements of the Good Web that exist right now. Ofcom does a lot of research. We do a lot of longitudinal studies, and we do annual trackers of people's attitudes and opinions and how they use the internet. So it's worth saying that, it's worth emphasizing that we do have components of a Good Web right now. 6 out of 10 people agree that the internet allows them to pursue interests and hobbies in a way that they couldn't otherwise. And nearly half of people agree that the internet allows them to share opinions more easily online than offline. So there are aspects of that that should be recognized and preserved as we move forward. So I am a podcast person, and I really like this podcast called Regulate Tech. Probably wouldn't surprise you, as I'm a tech regulator. But on a recent episode of this podcast, they did the ABCs of regulation, of things that are driving regulation. I thought that was just brilliant. So Richard Allian, if you're listening, I'm a big fan. I'm shamelessly ripping off your idea, and I thought it would be good to share Ofcom's Good Web ABCs. So for A, we have access. In order to have a good web, people need to have access to reliable broadband. So from Ofcom's perspective, we track this on 2 measures. So we track affordability of internet connectivity to broadband or mobile networks. We also track accessibility. So people can use our accessibility tracker tool to track mobile coverage or broadband speeds. And then we provide tips and tricks on how to get better coverage if you're in rural areas, or if you're in a blackout zone like I am in my London flat for some reason. So B, behavior. And here, within Ofcom, we think more about media literacy when it comes to behaviors online. So we have a long-standing statutory obligation to promote media literacy, and that's not limited to online, it's also with traditional media, radio. We cover a lot of different sectors, telecommunications, spectrum, even post. So we take a really expansive view of media literacy as promoting the having the knowledge and skills to be able to know where information comes from, how it's getting to you, how to make the most of these communications technologies. So part of that is also having insights into how people behave online. So that goes back to the kind of research and tracking of people's online experiences and behaviors. We also have a relatively new team within Ofcom that's looking more at the user experience or choice architecture. So how the design of different services can influence online behaviors. And that's one of the things, for example, in the online safety context that we're looking at in terms of how that might contribute to the experience of harms online. So moving on, C is for content. This is a tricky one because while we are building up our expertise in online, the prevalence or impact of online harms and illegal content, the regimes that we're pursuing are fundamentally not content-based regimes. It wouldn't be up to Ofcom to make any kind of judgments on individual accounts or individual pieces of content. So when we say that this is a systems and processes regime, what we mean is that we will be looking at, for example, another C, the community standards, that how they're developed and deployed by companies, and how they take a system-wide approach to identifying and mitigating risks to users, and then making that information available through transparency reporting or through things like an easily accessible complaints mechanism that users are aware of and can access. So there's another C here, collaboration. This one is of utmost importance. A lot of the regulatory frameworks that we're pursuing or already are already in play. So we, as a quick footnote, while the online safety bill is still in development, we are already regulating video sharing platforms under a piece of European law, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which was incorporated prior to Brexit. So one of the things that we've learned there is just how important that collaboration is. Collaboration with the regulated services, but also with a wider range of stakeholders, because at its core, both of these regimes are decentralized and they're about shared responsibility. It's, we would need all the resources in the world to be able to scrutinize and monitor every action on every platform. It's just not practical, it's not desirable. So it really is trying to move the needle through that kind of healthy and open collaboration with different stakeholders. I'll speed it up. We're not going to go through the whole alphabet. We're just going to make it to E. So D is for data. So I've already spoken a little bit about Ofcom's research. That's really central to what we do. There's another part, which is gathering external evidence and building our evidence base and trying to better understand just how all the many complexities and facets of these challenging problems. So for example, we did a call for evidence over the summer that ran for about 3 months. Got nearly 100 responses back from a really wide range of stakeholders. A lot of them are really chunky, great reading for someone like me. And yeah, that's building up the evidence base and making sure that we have the appropriate evidence to justify and to fund any interventions that we might recommend is of utmost importance. There's also, when we have so many info sources, whether it's meetings or formal consultations or information gathering powers, it's a lot of data. It's reams and reams and reams of data. So we've got a new function within Ofcom, which is we've got a new chief data officer and a whole team that's dedicated to helping us make sense of the volume of data and then make sure that it feeds into our policy development processes. Data protection is also important here, which is why we collaborate so closely with the Information Commissioner's Office through the banner of the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which I can talk a bit more about later, but trying to ensure that where there might be tensions between safety and privacy and other fundamental rights, that we're really tackling this head on and coming at this with a really collaborative and open approach to working with our fellow regulator on the data protection side. Finally, E, in Richard Allen's version, it was energy, which I really liked because that's something that a lot of us within Ofcom care deeply about. We do have a track on sustainability and climate change and trying to reduce our own carbon footprint. But I wanted to flip this one and talk about the energy of employees and just the amount of people that we've been recruiting, the experience, the expertise, and yeah, the fresh energy that we've been bringing into Ofcom to help us take on this challenge, I think is also another really important piece of the puzzle. So I'll leave it there. Maybe we can pick out some more letters later, but I'll pass it over to Lauren.
We were just going to start shouting letters at you.
Yeah, exactly. T, transparency. See? Ooh, that's a hard one. I'll think. I'll come back on that.
So Lauren, we've heard that we need better infrastructure, better digital infrastructure. We've heard that we need better systems and processes. I'd be really love to hear from you how you see the kind of role of industry and other stakeholders in kind of building those things and developing those systems and processes.
Good question. I thought I'd start with a few reflections from my career, not just in industry, but also working in a more civil society and government context. And I think what really provoked me about this conversation was this point about the role of the UK and what the UK can do in terms of building a positive vision for the web, and also Professor Alex, your point really resonated about us not doing the best job in talking about the positive vision. My experience, contrary to this, working in the context of sort of building a positive web over the last 10 years in the UK and internationally has been quite different. I started after moving from South Africa to the UK, working at a Centre for Social Innovation called the Young Foundation based in East London, working with some of the really disadvantaged communities in the country, but working with the most amazing local grassroots organizations who were engaging young people using digital technologies and social innovation to really empower them to be leaders of change in their communities. I then moved into UK government, and I was working in government digital services as part of it felt really radical movement at the time to really transform the way that public services were delivered. And it wasn't about the tech, it was genuinely about transforming the relationship between the citizen and the state. And there was something quite powerful being part of that. And then I moved over to what was then DFID, Department for International Development, and had the opportunity to lead their digital strategy for doing development in the digital world. And this was all about both how we could transform as an aid agency and deliver aid more impactfully and more effectively, including people digitally, and thinking about how countries could really drive transformation at pace and at scale through digital. And also starting to think sort of at the level of what does digital policy look like, or what does doing policy look like in a digital world. It was a really energizing and exciting sort of movement to be part of. And then as part of that, sort of sprung off into the private sector, and I'm currently working at BT, looking at things like digital inclusion, digital impact, digital rights, and thinking about the role of the private sector having a lot of power and influence as well as scale, and how we can use that in a way that is actually about empowering people through digital technologies and the internet. So I wanted to start off with a positive vision. I feel there is something there that is happening in the doing in the UK, and how can we be telling the story and moving the dial more? I think a really powerful story there about driving sustainable development, good governance, a focus on inclusion coming through here. And for me, really, a focus on leaving no one behind in the digital world coming through powerfully. But I feel also over the years working in the space, there's been a real shift that has moved from talking about opportunity and if we could just include everyone, how much benefits would be unleashed, to really a discourse of risk and a sort of closing down of opportunity. And I think we're at a real tipping point on that, and it is a moment that we need to be resetting this discourse. So I'm really excited by this work that you are leading at Demos in terms of thinking about what a positive vision for the web is. I think there's a risk that talking about risk will actually further close down the values and benefits that we can get, and we need to balance that discussion. So the three thoughts that I wanted to throw out in terms of how we build a good web are as follows. Firstly, from your brilliant piece that I read before this, I think there's been a real problem of managing risk retrospectively once the genie's already out of the bottle, and we've got a lot of bolt-on solutions. And I think the first part of this approach needs to be really proactive. I think we need a human rights by design approach where impacts on people are thought about at the start of setting, whether it's global standards, baking into business models for companies, thinking about the way that we develop new products and services as we take them from concept to market, rather than retrospectively as risks materialize. So that's my first point. It's going to be 4 Ps, by the way. So my second 2 are about principles and practice. I think a principle-based approach is the right way, because principles enable us to be consistent in our approach and drive a consistent vision, but they also give us flexibility that as technologies change, as people's minds change and perceptions change, we are able to keep up and adapt our practice around that. Practice, really important. I feel a lot of these problems are really huge and it's hard to know where to start, and we often get a bit paralyzed by that. And I think actually diving in what I've learned, working in a big company like BT, working in government, start somewhere, try something, test, learn out loud, iterate to get better. So I think making practice at the heart of this model will be really key. And then my final key is people. I think that contrary to all the talk about technology, it's not about technology, it is about people, as you said earlier, Alex. And I think multi-stakeholderism is something we're really going to have to fight for going forward. So a few questions that spring from this that I'd love some of your answers to is what is the role of different sectors, whether it's government or regulators, business, civil society and citizens, really importantly in building a good web. What responsibilities lie with different parts of the tech stack and the tech ecosystem, which is increasingly complex and interconnected? How do we all band together to respect and protect rights? I have a big question about who gets to set standards and regulation, who's specifying products and building these business models, and how do we make all of this a bit less top-down and less centralized and more open and accessible to more diverse set of people? And I'd love to hear from those in the room if you know of any innovative mechanisms that we could try in this space, both what's not worked and what has. And then finally, sort of building on that, I think skills and empowerment, one of your E's and an S, will be a big part of getting all of these people to ladder together. And I think the point Alex made earlier is a really critical one, which is one about language. And how do we all start talking the same language to move the dial in the right direction together? I think we need human rights advocates who understand technology. We need technologists and product designers who understand human rights and who are diverse and represent all aspects of society. We need innovators who are ready to disrupt business models and really pioneer a fair approach to value exchange in this data-driven world. And we need policymakers, regulators, and even diplomats who understand the impacts of technology, how they're affecting societies, markets, and geopolitics. The Danish have a tech ambassador model, which is pretty cool in this space. And then my final point, which Demos, you I think can really take the lead in, is about consumers and citizens who champion and choose and use technology that does protect their rights, and how do you tap into and drive that momentum from there? My final point, given the theme of the role of the UK in all of this, is that I think that we do actually have a good number of these good web unicorns who are actually able to bridge across sectors and boundaries. Colin's a great example of that as a regulator who gets technology. And I think, how do we actually bring those voices to the fore and help us sort of lead and learn out loud as we find our way forward?
Thank you so much. I have a million questions, but I'm going to see if anyone from the audience wants to come in at this stage. If you have any questions for any of the panelists or topics of discussion. Yeah, in the green jacket.
Hi, I'm Tom Graf from the Good Things Foundation. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't quite prepared to be the first person to ask a question. So I'm still somewhat formulating my question in my head. But so we're a digital inclusion charity, and we support people who don't have access to the internet, who don't have digital skills. So how can we make sure that a good web, as it's developed, includes those voices that have been traditionally excluded, particularly those with limited digital skills or those who can't afford internet access or devices?
The question is, how do we include digitally excluded voices in these conversations and in tech policymaking? Who wants to kick off with that?
I can kick off, sure. So this is something that isn't new to Ofcom because we do so many consultations on so many of the sectors that we regulate. Indeed, looking at how we regulate the telecommunications sector, digital exclusion is a huge factor of that in trying to figure out how to make sure that people who live in rural areas or in other communities have the same access availability as other people. Similarly, if you think about things like post, it's a big question of how accessible things are, how far do you have to go to get to the closest post box. So that's something that that we think deeply about from a lot of different angles. We have a number of statutory duties for consultations, We take those very seriously. A lot of the consultations that we get, or a lot of the engagement that we do, is through proxies. So by engaging with NGOs like yourself, or people who, the UK has such a rich and diverse network of civil society organizations who cover so many different perspectives and characteristics and interest areas, whether it's, you know, the Epilepsy UK Society, Age UK, Quilting Society. There's just, it's so diverse. And we find it really beneficial to engage with those groups that bring that expertise, that can help contribute to our evidence base and really represent the concerns or the opportunities for the groups or characteristics that they're bringing to light. So that's something that's really important. We do a lot of direct citizen engagement and through studies as well. We do quite a lot of long-term qualitative studies with people. That's quite cool. If you ever have a chance to see some of the presentations where we bring out some of the film from the archives, it's always really fun to watch somebody in 1996 saying how, oh, they can't imagine why they would have a phone in their pocket all the time. Same person in 2006 saying that they're addicted to Snake, and now the same person now saying, I can't live without my smartphone. So I think being able to tap into both the kind of general mainstream attitudes and opinions while also reflecting those unique perspectives of different groups who might be disadvantaged for one reason or another. Building that bridge is what we do as a consumer regulator. So it's, yeah, big part of our job.
Lauren, I wonder if I could come to you building on that to ask, you mentioned consumers and citizens and the role that they play. Where do you think they have the most power to really be, you know, advocating for the better technology and better web that they want as well?
I mean, I think the most obvious starting point is for us, all of us as people, to think more critically about our personal data and be thinking about that as a commodity, and that we have power in giving that commodity over to others. And I think there's a different power dynamic at play at the moment, but I don't think that we as ordinary people think about that stuff. So I think raising critical awareness about personal data, empowering people to take more control over that, not just in closing down and not sharing it anymore, but actually having control over how it's being used, and for example being empowered to shape ways that it can be used to improve population health or other things. We know from the research that we did with you, Ellen, that a lot of people are very ambivalent about the power of tech and data. On the one hand, I think they feel really worried about government and corporates having too much power in the equation and fear that their data will be used against them. But they also actually see there as huge potential in being able to share their data for good. And I think being able to find that sweet spot to empower people to share in that way would be pretty a good step forward.
Absolutely. And spoiler alert, we have a report coming out over the next few months on people's experiences of their personal data and controlling it. So keep an eye out for that one.
I think there are two really interesting perspectives you can take on this. So let's see what happens if you take the infrastructure angle or you take the not infrastructure angle. And if you take the not infrastructure angle, then you look to California advertising companies to solve this problem, and my God, they've been trying, right? So what happens in the world where an organization like Facebook, for instance, wants to increase its market share? Well, it suddenly bundles the app with the Android phone, or perhaps it negotiates with your tariff provider in the country that it wants a greater penetration for, that the data that you use on Facebook is not charged to your thing, so that it becomes incredibly affordable to use Facebook under these specific set of tariffs, right? So we can leave it to the market to innovate, and that would solve your problem for you. But the problem, I think, with that is, again, it comes back to this idea of design principles as to, like, why are, is the Good Things Foundation going to advocate for Facebook being bundled and provided free of charge to everybody with an Android phone? I would argue almost certainly not, right? What instead you might say is, well, what would an infrastructural provision of the internet look like? I remember the 2017 Labour manifesto sort of talked about broadband access for everybody. This was pre-pandemic, so I know a lot of people, when the pandemic hit, suddenly sort of realised actually perhaps this was a sensible suggestion, which I think at the time was laughed out of the room. So I think you can approach it from two perspectives. Market players will solve it. Don't you worry about that. It's just they probably won't solve it in the way that you want it to, and they won't solve it for the reasons that you want them to solve it. Alternatively, you say, actually, you know what? Internet access is an infrastructural requirement for a digital society, and I need it in order to pay my bills, or do my tax returns, or find a job, or stay in contact with my friends and family. As such, we ought to be provisioning it as infrastructure and not leaving it bundled in you know, to use the former example, right? Yeah.
I wanted to ask Alex, your vision of infrastructure, how does it differ from what Colin and Lauren were saying? Not to start a panel but just how does it differ? Was that the kind of vision of infrastructure that you came to?
Yeah, I think there's so much overlap there, and it's super interesting to hear about, you know, thinking from, you know, in your time at DFID, and thinking about, you know, actually what does the development world tell us about, you know, about moving toward this. And I think Colin was talking about design goals and systems and processes. What ultimately, I think the question we're trying to answer is, what are the motivations behind provisioning technology? What are the reasons that technology is designed the way it is? What is the reason why we do things the way we do? And I think in most things in life, we tend to look for a balance of different metrics, a balance of different reasons, you know, of what success looks like in a certain thing. So to use an example, we would say that, let's take healthcare in a European tradition. We'd say that it's not just how profitable the healthcare system is as the primary motivation of success. We would say, you know, to what extent is it provisioning, you know, to what extent is it accessible to the population, to what extent is it available to people, can it provision something? It is not just a purely profit-making sense of
Setting the right KPIs and the right incentives, which I think you also brought
yeah,
up.
right. I think that's
What we're trying to do with the online safety bill.
Exactly. So I think actually there's an enormous amount of crossover in between everything that you're hearing on the panel, and really it's just the whole infrastructure thing is just what happens if we looked at digital technology through this lens. If we were to start from square one, which obviously we're not going to, although, you know, with the way the technology moves, sometimes you go to a coma for 10 years and you wake up and the world's incredibly different. So maybe the world is changing, you know, so quickly that we might also be at the beginning of something, whether that's Web3 or whether it's the metaverse or whether it's something else here or there. The question is, why is this being built the way it is? Is it in order to maximize shareholder value? If so, that's the track that we're on at the moment, and it's provisioned us with lots of amazing things, and also I think it's created a lot of really intractable problems. Can we balance those motives with a range of other motives as well?
Yes.
I just want to follow up on that, because it was a very interesting discussion, and delighted to hear the level of agreement. And Alex, I like your use of the word infrastructure. I use it in the sense as well, although often there's a lot of confusion because it's not generally understood in that way. But this point about, and you'll talk about health, you know, what matters is the outcomes. And I just wanted to sort of ask Lauren about that, because I think one of the things about, you know, Ofcom's obviously got to do what it can do first. I'm not arguing with that, but this issue about, you know, coming at it from a process point of view, because you're not going to judge any individual piece of content, is exactly right. But you are going to have to judge whether the mechanisms being used to moderate and control content are adequate. And while that might be relatively straightforward in areas where people are likely to complain if they don't like it, a lot of the things we're talking about are things where no one's going to complain. If you're being led down some rabbit hole into radicalization, you are being harmed, but it's unlikely that people are pretty skilled at doing this in a way that does not prompt someone to complain about it. And I'm just interested in your views about whether you think we have adequate techniques and mechanisms to be able to actually assess, as it were, in an outcomes-based way, the quality of, and I particularly noticed I like the work, I'd love to see the stuff comes out of the request for information, but on the AVMS stuff, I think when you ask people to give you some evidence of how well their stuff works, your comment was a little bit rubbish, which is not terribly surprising, frankly. And I think it's likely to continue that way unless Ofcom is quite assertive about how you actually tell whether this stuff is working. So I'm just interested in whether you've got any views as to what the answer to that problem is.
Well, first of all, I've got a report for you. We have just published our first transparency report on year one. Transparency report is a bit of a misnomer because traditionally understood in the ICT field, it's transparency reporting on the public sector side, or the private sector side is about, for example, government requests for data, content removals, etc. But we are where we are, so we call it a transparency report too. But what it is it's a bit of a kind of a literature review of the information, all of the information that we gleaned from our information requests in year one of the VSP regime. It's about 110 pages, so it's not for the faint of heart. However, Natasha Lomas at TechCrunch did a really great summary of this, so you could read that if you're short on time. But it was really, really exciting because we went into year one of the VSP report really trying to level set to better understand what the state of the art is, what the companies are doing, what their community standards or existing systems and processes look like, at square one of the regime. And then the idea is to, once you start developing a better understanding and start building those relationships and having that exchange of information that we envisage, I mean, it's not totally equal because they have to comply with our information requests, but it works better, the relationship works better if you do have that kind of more contact. And that was one of our big lessons learned, was that those platforms that were more open to learning with us and trying to, nobody has the right answer. If somebody had the right answer, this would have been fixed. So we're all coming at it from our different perspectives and learning together ultimately and trying to solve this problem, which is the experience of harms online. So the report is one thing. The other thing I think you might be touching on is the more technical side of what the systems and processes might look like under the bonnet. We have been recruiting like mad. I sit within the technology group, so the technology and data innovation group, where I'm a policy person in the tech function and serve as a bit of the connective tissue between our in-house technologists and then our policy making functions. So a lot of the people that we've recruited are machine learning experts in natural language processing. We've got people who are experts on recommender systems. And the jury's still out about things like the skilled persons provisions within the online safety bill and how those will be used and by whom. But for us, what we've been trying to do, and by that I mean whether it would be a third party, whether it would be an auditor, we don't really know yet. We're actually waiting for some of these details to be cleared up as the legislation isn't fully formed. It's still in the parliamentary process. But in the meantime, we are doing our very best to recruit that expertise and get in those technical experts, begin building, for example, solutions labs where we might be able to create the environment in which we could have that kind of skilled person's capability in-house. And I mentioned earlier the reams and reams of data. It's also being able to have the technical know-how to be able to say, okay, we're not trying to look at any kind of source code, but being able to say, ask good questions. So if the question is about model thresholds or something like that, how do you develop them? How do you interpret them? How do they plug into the broader human technical system, which is the kind of system and process, whether it's a particular proactive technology, a particular hashing technology that is used to triage and send content to a specialized moderation team. We are gradually building up our understanding to be able to tackle that challenge. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that is a good one. That's very encouraging. And all I'd say is I think a public commitment, as it were, to be able to establish a standard to judge these things would be really good. And I really like Alex's comment in his report about the fact that it can't just be the government that does this. It needs to be a capability that is enabling for different kind of sections of society, as it were, to express their own views as to what. It's a difficult thing. I'm not saying it's really hard, but that was a good answer. I like that. Thank you.
And then.
Hi, thank you so much. Really, also so nice to be in a physical event again. I'm still
So one thing I'm always interested in is levels of abstraction. So philosophers have been talking about what good looks like for a very, very long time. And so in particular, the UN Declaration of Human Rights puts 3 buckets in there, being freedom, peace, and justice. Inclusion generally fits under justice, and freedom, inclusion also includes the right to be excluded as well, which I think is kind of what Alex was getting at. You should be able to kind of opt out of these systems as well as opt into them. I really like the idea of, like, because I think the key thing around that metaphor of infrastructure is infrastructure for democracy. This is what we're talking about. You can't say infrastructure without that partner side. You know, we spoke about human rights and human rights approach as well, and all of these other kind of like higher, loftier values, I suppose, that we're driving towards. So I think you're right when we're talking about the fact, though, that there isn't enough conversation about what good looks like. But I'm curious about what level of abstraction are we talking about. So, you know, generally, like, I kind of go to events and that means the press. So it just means maybe a Baker, you know, Paul Baker isn't talking about this enough. Or I go to other events and the problem lies elsewhere. So what level of abstraction are we talking about? And then how do we slot ourselves into it so that we can actually create this new good web? And that's my question. And there's kind of a second part and a second thought to this as well, which is that actually I think that we need to allow room for dissent in terms of what good looks like. Like all of the literature that I'm reading at the moment comes out of this kind of idea of being able to opt out and dissent. I think that's kind of a crucial part of like the future that we're missing. We don't want to go back to the 90s and that kind of like the best idea is in politics. There is no politics anymore. There is history. There is no conflict. I think we need to incorporate that into whatever this infrastructure looks like for democracy as well. But my question is, where does the problem lie in terms of this conversation, and how do we resolve that and move forward into the future?
What a question. I think like the cop-out answer is sort of to each his own, really, and you can answer this question at any level. I think, you know, so it comes down to you know to us individually, to if we are acting as consumers, it's to choose in a way that is that we think makes sense. And if we are given the option to choose spaces or platforms or we can change things about the way that we engage with technology that is better in line with you know, supporting those who are creating spaces that are built along lines that are not purely you know, created under the kind of design for profit, for want of a better word. Let me give you an example. There's the Jack Dorsey, who I think has now left Twitter, or maybe he's still sort of why did the Twitter phone beep? You haven't left yet. Hi, Elon. So Elon is tuning in. But anyway, so Jack, one of the things that he sort of was texting Elon about when all those things got leaked was that he wanted to set up a project which he called Blue Sky, and actually took off. They were actually running for 3 or 4 years, and I think they've now gone into beta. And effectively, what it tries to do is it tries to replace Twitter, which Jack Dorsey decided his big regret was that it was a platform and it wasn't a protocol. And for those of you who don't know what a protocol is, and I'm relatively new to this as well, protocol is something like email. So if I have a Gmail account and Ellen has a Hotmail account, we can still send each other an email. Now, if someone's on Twitter and I'm on Facebook, no dice. We can't message one another. And so what he was trying to build was an infrastructural solution. So replace social media with a sort of a more egalitarian version, which he called a protocol. Now the question then is, well, is that better? Is that good? Does this represent, like, to your question, does this represent something that we ought to be aiming for as good? And I would say yes, because if you look at the principles that underpin that piece of technology, you know, it uses the principles on which it's designed, and we sort of talked about this earlier, are ones which I think are much more closely aligned with those of liberal democracy, things like interoperability, things like access, and so on. So I guess the point I'm saying is that we, as speaking as the people in this room, I think for us it's about choosing. It's choosing to what we can do is to choose things that we think represent a step forward from this, rather than that at a baseline is what's in our power. If we are technologists, if we are policymakers, if we are decision makers, perhaps there are other things that we can abstract to.
I have to respond to this one because that was precisely why this was the toughest talk to come into, with literally sort of no boundaries about how you could come in and respond to these questions. But I think you're raising a really important point about dissent. And one of the things I was rereading just before this was that great paper, I think it's an Oxford paper, about the 4 positive visions of the web, of the internet. And there is more than one way of having a positive vision about the web, and often these are very intertwined with culture and values. And there's one that's the Silicon Valley version, which is all about open and decentralization. You've got the DC model, which is the market-led approach. You've got a Brussels model, which is around privacy and human rights at its core, and you've got a Beijing model, which is a bit more top-down and paternalistic, but very much about social value and collectivism. And I was reading that and trying to think, implicit in some of the assumptions that we're talking through, we are giving a culturally laden view of what a good web is, and is it right to take a culturally specific view? What makes one better than the other, and how do we decide which of those pathways is the right one? And if we're trying to find a global framework, can we include space for all of those models to work? And are there any fundamentals that need to be true for it to be good? I don't have the answer to that, but your question is a good one.
Yeah, very happy to talk about international alignment and international where we might see frameworks emerging at a later point, but I will defer back to our national framework that we're working on and our national jurisdiction that we're working within, and throw some more Ofcom research out to help me answer this question. So in our last Online Nation report, we found that 4 out of 5 users had concerns with going online, and 2 out of 3 had a harmful experience, what they found to be a harmful experience recently online. So I think what good would look like, or what the ultimate outcome that we're seeking to achieve with this regulation is for people to have that safer life online. So if you think about increasingly the way that companies are approaching this task of risk and harm is through what they call trust and safety teams. And I find that quite interesting, because to me, trust and safety, they're both these big concepts like good, they're kind of feelings, they're subjective. And I think ultimately what good would look like is for people to trust, to have more trust in the services and each other, and to feel more safe. I mean, it's a bit of a woolly answer, but it's a really big philosophical question. And what that might look like is to have fewer people saying, you know, I left this conversation, I left this online civic space because I didn't feel safe. Because I didn't trust what was going on around me. I didn't trust the service that I was using. I didn't trust the other users to, treat me with respect or dignity. So I think if we can get to a point where people do feel safer, where our monitoring that we do, where our Online Nation, annual tracker is showing that fewer people are having these kinds of experiences, fewer people are dropping out of the discourse, then that would be good.
And if I can come in quickly on the dissent point as well, is I think we've talked a lot about processes, about how do we get to the point of having a good web, how do we make it inclusive, how do we make it accessible. And I think part of the problem at the minute is we have a lot of dissent. There's dissent all over the place about what the web should look like. You go on any online space and you can find people saying why they don't like it, why it doesn't work for them, why it doesn't meet their needs. But there's not really anywhere for that to go. It's just sort of tossed out into the ether, and maybe if enough people complain loudly, then maybe a shareholder might listen. But at the moment, it's just sort of, you can complain about it, but nothing happens. And I think that's part of the kind of essence of also a good web of if something is wrong, and if there's disagreement, and if there's debate about what the outcome should be, there's a way to have that conversation that leads somewhere, rather than just people have a fight about it and then Elon Musk does what everyone was going to do anyway. Over here and then over there.
Yeah, I found everything sort of reasonably optimistic up to now. Before I walked through the door, I was kind of thinking, I'm a paranoid by nature. So so there's all that other stuff going on, from dark webs to crime online to all this other stuff. And I'm kind of, in my mind, I'm trying to put those two things together. You know, what you've been saying, I've been saying that's really quite good, you know. I also have this, the old Alice in Wonderland thing of running as fast as you can and staying where you are. That we kind of, you know, the bad guys are at least as good as the good guys. So we're fighting this battle. At the moment, it's not clear whether the good guys are going to just stay ahead enough so that all of our power systems aren't switched off by some guy in Russia or China or somewhere. So that was kind of the unease I've got, and I don't know how you comment on that. But I thought what you might like to give us is a kind of a 5-year view as to where you think we might be heading. I say I've got the good side. How likely is it you think that the good side is going to get there in 5 years? I'm not asking for the, you know, the end of the world scenario, but the sort of what you might call your more likely scenario for 5 years. So an optimistic kind of one where the good web, I'm not sure whether it takes off, but it's in there fighting, and your more realistic view of where you think we might be in.
I also have a question to add on to that, which is what is at stake if we don't get it right? If the good web does not come to fruition, what's going to be the outcome?
I think that kind of comes to this question we had around abstraction and around values, right? Like I buy the idea that you need to opt out, that there needs to be an ability to opt out, but I also don't buy the idea that, well, I also support the idea that there are principles that I believe in that I think a good way of internet, they are not just, they're not up for debate. I don't think the Chinese model is a good internet. I think it's an effective one, but I don't think it's a good one. I don't think that the Silicon Valley model is a good one either. I want something different. I don't apologize for wanting those things. And then that's, so can we move towards that as the question, well, what does the 5-year outlook look like? It's tough to say. I think that the principles of interoperability and egalitarianism that early internet pioneers wrote into the very fabric of the internet are remarkably strong to this day. We just recently had an election at the ITU, which is a body which sets standards, basically like what does the internet look like. You know, and it was a choice really between effectively a candidate that was promoted by Chinese model and then sort of the Western one with a landslide. Again, talking up questions around interoperability and so on. So there are bastions of a free, open, global internet that I think are still strong. That said, there's the same, whether the power of kind of corporate, whether the power of the sort of Silicon Valley plus now sort of the Beijing models disappear or whether they get stronger, I'm less sure if they'll be replaced with something new. I think at the very least, or I think at the very best, we're likely to see a continuation of kind of what we've got at the moment.
Colin, you have a roadmap, I believe.
Yes, I
For the
do. This is
years
not
to go
about
forward.
5 years. This is the next about 18 months. But I do have 3 copies of Ofcom's roadmap to regulation going. So I'll say one for you. I think 5 years in internet time is so long. It's like 20 years. 5 years in policy time or like in regulation, that's like what? 3 consultations. Like it's not as long. So I'm kind of struggling to juxtapose those two viewpoints, if I'm honest. How one of the big challenges that we have is building a regime that does cover the estimated 20,000 plus in scope services and all their varieties of resources and services and functionalities, and make this regime prescriptive enough so as to be implementable while keeping it flexible enough to be able to iterate over time, to be able to respond to the changing ecosystem, the changing nature of harms and threats. I like it, you know, I'm by nature a bit of an optimist, but I think it is important to have the reality of the situation in the frame. I don't think that anybody is kidding themselves and thinking that a piece of legislation or all the good guys in the world will be able to fully eradicate all pieces of harmful or illegal content for always and forevermore. That's just not how it works. And especially where you are allowing for services that give people permissionless communication to be able to exchange information, ideas, images, videos, you're gonna get some awful stuff. I mean, it's kind of like the numbers game that eventually, you know, you'll get NS, not safe for work content popping up. So I think what we're trying to do is have a culture change within organizations, within companies, within the broader society to prioritize, to acknowledge the reality of this illegal content or behavior that does manifest online, and begin prioritizing or at least giving equal weight to the detection and mitigation of those risks as you would to your KPIs and to your profit motive, etc. So I would hope that the 5-year vision, I hope that we're not exactly where we are. That would be quite sad. Although, as you say, it's the Red Queen effect, where you're running in place, and you know technology is changing around you, and there is also it's a really fine balance with things like transparency, where transparency can be really helpful for identifying potential sources of bias or discrimination, or shedding light on internal systems and processes and how things are determined and how things work. But it can also be really helpful for gaming the system and for figuring out how to work around systems and processes that are designed to detect, you know, child online abuse imagery, terrorist content, etc. That's a big problem with cryptographic hashing. You know, a lot of older cryptographic hashes have been broken, and they're not as effective anymore because they have been you know, uncoded, and they can be gamed. So yeah, it's difficult. I think that it does benefit from these multi-stakeholder conversations. Interdisciplinary thinking is really helpful here. This is how we begin to solve complex problems. So I would hope that in 5 years' time, we have more people, more disciplines, more companies, more civil society organizations that are on this problem, and working together more effectively to be able to advance us, to be treading water in a forward direction, and keeping pace with the rate of change.
Lauren, my answer to that is in a slightly different direction. I wonder in 5 years, maybe it will be longer, but I think it could be sooner than we expect, that we won't need to be talking about a good web, we'd be talking about a good world, because I actually think what we're seeing is this mainstreaming of the internet and digital technologies and data. It's becoming so part and parcel of everyday life. And I think over the years I've been working on this agenda, it was sort of a side stream of conversation, particularly in government. There were sort of a few people who understood this stuff and talked about it and negotiated at the margins, and it's coming to the fore of sort of geopolitics and international values and rules-based system. All of this stuff is becoming an underpinning to all of it. So I think your question is a big one, but it's actually bigger than the web. The web is just becoming one of the enablers of that political contestation. So I wonder if we might be having a slightly different framing of the conversation by then, as this becomes part and parcel of how international politics and power is done. And I'm sorry, that's a very meta answer, but my attempt to think to the future. I hope that digital and web becomes less the thing we have to talk about, and more that this is part and parcel of how we talk about equality and inclusion and freedoms and values.
Will be the Good World Network.
Exactly. And demos have taken over the world.
I think we have time for one more question.
This may well not make sense, so forgive me if it doesn't. So I work for BBC Media Action as a BBC's media support charity, BBC comes into this question, so just to get that out of the way. What you just said about this potentially coming from multi-stakeholder conversations, it is, and how this does realise itself, is that actually remotely possible at the moment? The web ultimately at the moment is really a creation of individuals, isn't it? And very clear visions of individuals. There's Bezos, there's Zuckerberg, there's Brin, likely to be now Musk. And I know the debate in the US with Ethan Zuckerberg and you talked to a lot, and the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure often reverts back to how the BBC was created and a vision of John Reed. That someone had a vision, and that's what ultimately got enacted, and he does say that that moment is obviously past, but it doesn't mean to say that it's not worth thinking about what that moment might have been, and I think what you're saying too happens. So actually, isn't there a need for an extremely clear vision, a Beveridge report or something like that, which lays down, which would be a result of multi-stakeholder conversations, but lays down an extremely clear vision? I'm not saying that that's a good idea, because I think partly of it is terrifying, and it's also a completely wrong analogy, that this is a global phenomenon and you can't do this at a national level. But it's very difficult to see how this gets translated into practice unless there is real clarity about not just the principles or what it might look like, but actually the plan to get there. As I say, I find that actually slightly terrifying myself, that idea, but nevertheless, I can't quite see how the future is not going to be continuing to be realized by either very malicious states or very powerful, unaccountable individuals really trying to monetize as much as possible.
I love this question. It makes a lot of sense to me. So I think if we cast our minds back to the genesis of the internet, it was fundamentally, well, originally it was Department of Defense, right, DARPA, and then it was academic, but then it was multi-stakeholder for a shining moment, and anyone could contribute to these internet engineering task force, these standards and protocols. Then we had the commercialization, then we had walled gardens. But in the midst of this commercialization, we also had things like the World Summit on the Information Society, WSIS, which the WSIS agreement was, I think, the first global attempt to do exactly what you're talking about, to chart a way forward, to have a charter, to have a big statement, a big vision of what multi-stakeholderism looks like, what multi-stakeholder internet governance could look like. And this was what led to the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, which continues to this day and will be held in Addis in November. So I think that's something that has been chugging along. Obviously, the kinds of geopolitical tensions that Alex mentioned, the new IP debate in the ITU, even the tensions within the UN ecosystem of this kind of more multi-stakeholder, more distributed, more egalitarian way of approaching internet governance, which shakes out of the IGF, and the more nation-state, multilateral, sovereignty-based model in the ITU. It's quite interesting to watch those power tussles play out. What is the way forward? It's tricky. I think what we're seeing now are clusters of like-minded actors that are seeking to band together, because it has been clear, as Lauren was saying, that there are many different models emerging. So from our perspective, for example, we've started up this global online safety regulators network with different countries like Australia, Canada, the EU. Kind of, it's complicated with the EU right now still, but really looking at the Digital Services Act or different regulatory frameworks that are emerging. This doesn't get to multi-stakeholderism necessarily. However, there is some really interesting work being done on thinking about modularity. So just like you would have modularity in the technical components, so the fact that USBs are standardized so that they can be interoperable, so that you can use common hardware, software interchangeably. Trying to think about a woman called Susan Nass and Chris Riley, who have done a collaboration, published a few articles in Lawfare about what modularity would look like in the internet governance context. and trying to pick out different modules of the approach to regulation, whether it's something like a green common standards for transparency reporting or audit provisions that are common to many different regulatory frameworks, and then thinking about how that could be fostered or taken over by multi-stakeholder networks. So if you've been involved in standards, then if I mention the IANA transition, you might wince like I do. So the jury is out about whether or not multi-stakeholder management of critical resources like the DNS that ICANN manages, or critical functions like the audit standards for international online safety regimes, how that would work. But I think it's really inspiring that people are thinking about it and looking for different chunks that we might be able to contextualize within that model.
Lauren, thank you for your response and any final reflections.
I agree with you that multi-stakeholderism is incredibly challenging operating at a global level and coming together, and the implicit assumption of a consensus-based solution that will then set clarity of vision. But I do wonder, Colin, if there's something in there in all these forums that do exist and bring that multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinarity together, how those fora might become more mainstream, because my sense is those are still operating somewhat at the margins of some of the big debates that are happening here, or they're having them in parallel, and how do you centralize those conversations in that multi-stakeholder model? The alternative is, I feel there must be innovations in multi-stakeholderism that we haven't yet thought about, and could we put our minds to that in the same way that we concertedly innovate with technology? So I would love to see some new models emerge around that as well.
Thank you. And Alex?
Well, I mean, I share your thoughts, really. I think it's really needed, and the question, I think, is who would write it? And maybe that speaks to weakness in international sort of multilateral institutions at the moment. I think NATO has been quite slow on this, but then maybe there is hope in some of the noises that are coming out of the UN. Antonio Gutierrez's stuff recently, he did the statement about the sort of future of the internet, which I think was quite positive. The language there was good. There's the one that came out of the US presidency. This comes up at the G7, G20 from time to time. So we're getting there. But I share your sort of your cautious your caution, and I think the thing that strikes me is that this is only one tiny part of an awful lot of things that we need to be worrying about in terms of thinking about what the international governance, the international rules are. I mean, I know that in this room there are experts on data transfer, on AI, and the regulation of AI. There's an awful lot that we need really good, tech-savvy, international multilateral institutions, that's a mouthful, to deal with thinking about that. These are global problems, and they come at a time, global challenges, let's call them that. And they come at a time where global multilateral institutions, I think, are struggling. And they're struggling with these kinds of problems specifically. Ironically, the big global multinational institutions that aren't struggling with these are the ones that are creating them. And I think there's an amazing graph you can find yourself somewhere, which is like the number of AI researchers pushing development in AI versus the number working on safety. Elliot will correct me if I totally mangled that, but it's like 100 to 1, So yeah, I think this speaks to a kind of a crisis in international multilateralism as much as it does a lack of vision in tech.
And also a risk that getting caught into each of those buckets and the complexity will take from the whole, I think, is the real risk.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I think that this point around how can we be building more spaces for building consensus, spaces for building disagreement, how can we be getting more stakeholders to work together in a productive way is really the kind of foundation of part of what we're hoping to contribute to with this network. And so we're really thankful to our speakers and thankful to you all for coming along tonight. in terms of next things on, we're going to be holding these events every month. Next December the 1st is our next one that will be diving into some of the process questions which have been raised this evening a bit more fully, thinking about the processes of tech policy making, what's working, what's not working. So we would love to see you all there. Please do stay around for a drink if you're free, and it just remains to say a massive thank you to our speakers for joining us tonight.